Thank you, Father Eduardo, Father Bakatu, Mr. and Mrs. Lavore, any hidden honored guests, and my dear brothers. I'm torn about speaking to you all this morning. Torn because as much as I would like to share with you about the life of my priest hero, I'm having flashbacks of standing at this very spot, weeping and wailing in attempts to tell you my vocation story just one short year ago. For the new men, just know that it was one heck of a sight. I guess I'll start out with some key details. The first of which is directed towards one subset of brothers in particular. No, my priest hero has no aliases that I'm aware of. He looks nothing like Brandon Gunther. He is entirely clean-shaven, and he has no soul patch. My priest hero is Father Stephen Dominic Borello, a priest of the Diocese of Joliet, and currently parochial vicar of Notre Dame Parish in Clarendon Hills, a.k.a. Chris Langford's parish. Father Steve's other assignment, though, is to be the official, unofficial butt kicker and reality check giver for the seminarians of our diocese. He's become famous all over northern Illinois and the Urbana-Champaign area for his virtue talks, which are tailor-made to each seminarian and are kind of like being punched in the face with a half dose of humiliation and a half dose of pure fervent charity all at the same time. I recall that the first time I ever talked to Father Steve was shortly before he was ordained a deacon during my first diocesan seminarian retreat, the summer before I entered St. John Vianney. Steve, as I knew him at the time, struck me as really smart, really funny, and really zealous, which makes sense since he studied chemistry and chemical engineering at the University of Illinois and was an active member of their Newman Center. I don't remember much about what he specifically said in this encounter, but I was impressed and intimidated. 1 year later, which would become one of the most important summers of my formation so far, I found myself being assigned to teach Totus Tuus. I was really looking forward to seeing how much I'd grown after 1 year of SJV formation by teaching the faith to the kids and teens and living in community with other laymen and women. And by that I mean I'd managed to grow an enormous ego during my first 2 semesters at St. John Vianney. I'd managed to withhold all of my wounds and vices from my brothers and even turned a blind eye to them myself. I gave people the impression that I had no struggles, except, of course, for a little sweet tooth, which I happily self-deprecated about. I went into Totus Tuus training that summer thinking, I've been in formation for the priesthood for a whole year. Therefore, I'm pretty much better than everybody else. I was self-righteous, judgmental, and really not the best person to be around. At that time, now Deacon Steve was made the assistant chaplain for our diocese Totus Tuus program and was at training almost the entire time. He was ordained a priest on the Saturday between week 1 and week 2 of training, and I even got to serve at his ordination. Of course, I had the cool job. I was the thurifer. I was deeply moved by my experience. It was the first ordination I'd ever been to, and I remember looking at him as he lay on the cathedral floor, and the choir chanted the Litany of the Saints. I hope I never forget the sight of him standing up after the litany. I knew that his face was drenched in tears. He seemed to be physically shaking with emotion, and I knew that the man in front of me knew what he was getting into. During the second week of training, he shared his whole vocation story with the entire group of 80 teachers. He spoke about being lukewarm in the faith for years and eventually falling away from the church until he reached the University of Illinois. His story was classic. He went through an Augustine-esque, St. Francis-esque conversion, which was sparked by a girl he was interested in, inviting him to a Newman Center koinonia retreat. A little reconciliation, a heck of a lot of prayer later, and the man has been on fire ever since. His vocation story was so genuine and human. He even talked about the struggles of discerning seminary, of falling in love, and learning to receive the gift of celibacy. Father Steve, however, made one potentially fatal decision. He joined the Diocese of Peoria. This was because he was studying at the University of Illinois, which was in that diocese. But don't worry, God in his mercy brought him home to the Diocese of Joliet. I would say that the 3 greatest virtues that Father Steve exemplifies are charity, joy, and devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Charity. Father Steve is one of the most selfless priests I know, not just with his time, but with the quality of the time that he gives. Father Steve walks the line of being too busy and just being outright ridiculous in the amount that he gives to other people. This summer, while living in the same rectory as Father Steve, I noticed that one day on his day off, he was wearing a sun hat and was packing a bag, which was not his common practice. I asked him where he was going. He was going to a camp for Catholic youths, which was an hour away, to spend the night, and the next day to hear confessions and lead Eucharistic adoration while sleeping in a cabin. Father, you're doing that on your day off? Yes, he replied, but you're already so busy and you're going to work on your day off? He responded with something along the lines of, the sacraments aren't work. I was shamed. And the next week I noticed, a week later, on the same evening of what would be his day off, I saw him carrying at least 10 books into the rectory. And being a cheeky young seminarian, I decided to kind of tease this young priest. And I got nosy and began to look through the books that he'd brought in. And all of them were kids' books for like middle schoolers and teens and tweens. What are you reading these for, Father? He said, I've got to speak the language of the kids and know what they're into and what they're talking about so I can better preach to them and relate to them. He spends his days reading kids' literature to better serve children. Not to mention, he would stay up many an evening later than he should have, building me up, encouraging me, and helping me in times of struggle, giving up precious hours of sleep before he took his early morning holy hour. He's always a text away from confession, and he goes wherever he's needed. The second virtue of Father Steve is joy. Father Steve loves kids. Every time children come and talk to him after Mass, he always gets down to their level and pretty much tells every boy that he should be a priest. He has endless energy, which explains his great devotion to the kids in our diocese as they spend their time in the Totus Tuus program. No matter what, Father Steve has a smile on his face and is always giving himself to others. Noticing his joy, which seemed never to go away, I once asked Father Steve, how do you do it? How can I do it? I don't ever really feel joy like that. And he said to me something that was pretty profound. He said, Michael, joy is not a gift we receive for ourselves. It's a gift that God gives us to give to others. Again, I was shamed with how little joy that I give in my life, how much little time and happiness I share with my brothers, as I tend to be pretty crabby. Finally, I will turn to the greatest virtue of Father Steve, which I believe to be is his devotion to Our Lady. When Father Steve told his vocation story, he mentioned how priests during the Litany of the Saints in the ordination rite tend to pray for one specific intention, and his was that his entire priesthood would be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget his devotion to Our Lady. Every day, the rosary is a non-negotiable in his spirituality. He's always relating things back to our Blessed Mother and her yes, her selflessness, her beauty, and the graces that she shares with us. Father Steve even turned the rosary into a fitness activity over me for the summer, encouraging me to go on rosary walks with him all over the neighborhood while he would stop and greet people in between decades. Brothers, I would just like to exhort you to take Father Steve, who has been a model of the priesthood in my own life, as a model for yourselves, especially in his love and devotion to Our Lady. Always be willing to offer your entire life through Jesus, for Jesus through Mary, totus tuus, completely his through her. Thank you very much for your attention. Praise be Jesus Christ.